Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Cox. I'm with NC State Libraries, and today I'm going to be presenting on ethics, epistemology, and scholarly communication, how epistemic injustice emerges throughout the scholarly communication life cycle. So first up, I'm just going to give a quick outline of what I'm going to be talking about over the next few minutes. So I'm going to do an introduction to the concept of epistemic injustice, talk a little bit about how epistemic injustice emerges in scholarly communication, and then specifically examine two aspects of scholarly communication in the form of conferences and publication that I view or can be viewed as epistemically unjust events. So what is epistemic injustice? So in 2007, Miranda Fricker coined the term epistemic injustice and wrote a book on the topic. So it's basically the combination of ethics and epistemology. So ethics is the study of what is the right or wrong action, and epistemology is a theory of knowledge. And according to Fricker, epistemic injustice is when we are wronged as knowers. And according to Fricker, epistemic injustice has two parts. So the first part is testimonial injustice, and she defines that as credibility deficits that members of subordinated groups experience due to social prejudice. So her central case of testimonial injustice is when a police officer doesn't believe a Black person due to their race. And the second kind of epistemic injustice she calls hermeneutical injustice, and she defines this as a gap in collective interpretive resources puts someone at an unfair advantage when it comes to making sense of their social experience. And for her, a central case of this would be a woman in the 1970s who's experiencing sexual harassment but struggles to describe their experience because the term sexual harassment just isn't widely used in society. So since Fricker's book came out in 2007, there have been there's been lots of research building on Fricker's work and developing different varieties of epistemic injustices and applying it to different type of environments. So Heidi Grasswick has applied epistemic injustice to scientific inquiry. And her logic goes something like this. So scientific inquiry is one of the most socially complex forms of knowing. So imagine trying to know something about your favorite sports team versus knowing something about maybe a medical procedure. So obviously it would be a lot more complicated to understand something about a medical procedure in comparison to finding out maybe why your favorite sports team is, having a bad streak or something like that. And due to the social nature of scientific inquiry, bias and stereotype can have influence. And these social injustices can push science in directions that create more injustices. So since scientific inquiry and scholarly communication are so intertwined with each other, it seems very natural to link epistemic injustice with scholarly communication, which many scholars in the fields of library science and scholarly communication have done over the past 20 years. And if we're following Grasswick's logic, I might apply epistemic injustice to scholarly communication in the following way. So we could say disseminating research outputs is socially complex. Due to this social nature, bias and stereotype can have influence in research communication, and social injustices can push scholarly communication in directions that create more injustices. So to dig into this a little bit deeper and look at some specific examples, I have just grabbed a tiny bit of the scholarly communication timeline here. And we can imagine that this timeline or circle of scholarly communication is much bigger, but I've just taken a little snapshot in terms of looking at conferences and publication. So I'm going to link academic conferences to the concept of hermeneutical injustice and link issues of publication to testimonial injustice. So first, we're going to take a look at academic conferences. So inequities in the academic conference world abound and are really spread over all the disciplines. And I was just struck within the first couple pages of a Google Scholar search that really a huge variety of disciplines are represented, from STEM to business to hospitality and tourism to education. It appears that every discipline has a lot of inequities when it comes to conferences. There's also issues with different formats of conferences, like in-person and virtual. There can be issues with different sizes of conferences. For example, large international conferences could really be the breeding ground for lots of different inequities. And these issues cover problems like just who can attend, to challenges at the actual conference venue, to how conferences can have a lasting effect on your career. And really, if you take a broad look at it, I think a lot of the inequities can basically come down to looking at in-groups and out-groups. So in-groups are typically described as white men, and out-groups at conferences are typically women, Black, Indigenous, scholars of color, those in the LGBT community, precarious scholars, disabled scholars, those from the global South, and even those living in local communities where conferences are held. So if we think about Grasswick's example of scientific inquiry and epistemic injustice, and she calls scientific inquiry our most socially complex form of knowing. And if we mix that with what we know about conferences, and it's one of academia's most social events to communicate that knowledge, it seems like these two areas are really ripe for ethical investigation due to the double whammy of social complexity. And in turn, how we might make meaning at conferences from those social experiences. And of course, meaning making is a big part of hermeneutical injustice. So one of the first examples that come to mind might be in groups at conferences discussing topics that out groups may not be familiar with. For example, if there's discussion about acronyms or jargon within your discipline, or even maybe viral things on social media, different audiences at the conference may not be able to make meaning out of those things. So if you're thinking particularly about international audiences attending conferences, this can be a big problem. And conference days are so tightly packed with events, and the conference time is so limited that this gap or exclusion in interpretive resources could have quick and compounding effects for some attendees. So if we think about how Fricker defines hermeneutical injustice, she says it's when a gap in collective interpretive resources puts someone at an unfair advantage when it comes to making sense of their social experience. And I applied that to the concept of conferences. So in my view, I'm saying it's a gap in or exclusion of collective interpretive resources puts some attendees at an unfair advantage when it comes to making sense of their conference experience. And Jose Medina has built on Fricker's interpretation of hermeneutical injustice, and he says that hermeneutical injustices can also happen through interpersonal dynamics. So things like skeptical stares and constantly interrupting or questioning one's meaning are some of the intimidations that can put unfair pressures on one's meaning-making abilities and meaning-sharing capabilities. So, when we think of conferences, people constantly interrupting or questioning one's meaning are probably one of the top complaints of conference presenters, conference attendees. So there appears to be a lot of connections between inequities at conferences and some of the varieties of hermeneutical injustice. And some of the harms of not just hermeneutical injustice, but epistemic injustice in general, Fricker is really worried about the loss of epistemic self-confidence. So you might imagine being at a conference and you have a colleague who's really questioning, maybe this conference isn't for me. Maybe I really need to think about if I should even attend conferences. Maybe the idea I had to bring to this conference, I don't want to pursue anymore because of a negative experience at a conference. So those are things that I think are really troubling, especially considering the expert knowers in society are obviously a big audience of academic conferences. So next up, I'm going to talk about some of the issues in the publication cycle. And I'm sure members of the Library Publishing Forum are very aware of some of the inequities in publishing. And I've just grabbed a few screenshots here of some of the examples that we see. So inequities with article processing charges, the good, the bad, and the rude peer review. So dealing with bias and stereotype in peer review and editorial practices, centering Western-based knowledge and whiteness in academic publishing, and also just some authors having a lot more privilege than others based on their name and institution. So it's obvious that testimonial silencing happens if the author is just completely barred from publishing due to these inequitable barriers. But I think it can also be interesting to look at some of the other ways publishing can be unjust. So whether it's due to the barrier of the article processing charge or biased peer review or editorial practices, it really can change the course of what a marginalized author can do with their work and how they want to communicate that work. So in these occasions, we can imagine an author may have to publish via another avenue. So they might have like a plan B, C, or D to publish their research. And we might have occasions where more privileged scholars may view these venues as less than due to publication prejudice. For example, the dominance of prestige publishing in academia. And these prejudices can cause marginalized scholars to experience credibility deficits. So some scholars will give less importance to their research, which is certainly ties back to the idea of testimonial justice and injustice. So as a reminder, Fricker defines testimonial injustice as credibility deficits that members of subordinated groups experience due to social prejudice. And I'm applying that to publication and scholarly communication. And I'm saying credibility deficits that marginalized scholars experience due to publication prejudice is one way we could interpret testimonial injustice. And again, the harm here is a loss of epistemic self-confidence when scholars face testimonial injustice, which is again very worrying considering that writing and scholars' testimony is a huge part of their career and livelihood. All right, so that wraps up my presentation. Just wanted to leave you with a few questions to consider here as far as what bias and stereotype in scientific inquiry are reflected and perpetuated in scholarly communication, and how do injustices within scholarly communication create more inequity for those interested in the research process. So I'm happy to answer questions about my presentation or enter into a discussion. And thank you for watching my presentation.